Hello and welcome to Whisky Shorts. Now, normally we saddle up and take a ride through the tales and characters that have shaped the history of Scotch whisky. Well, in this session I'm going to deviate a little and head down a slightly different road, and one that ultimately spluttered to a dead end and also ran. And yet it fits our narrative very well. This is the story of Scotland's other dram. Today we give it no second thought when it comes to Scotland's national drink of choice, but whisky did not always command such a lofty position, nor was it a foregone conclusion that it would. There was once a pretender to the throne, and perhaps not one you would immediately associate with the leaden skies and windswept hills and chiselled Georgian spires of Scotland, but rum was once the king in the north. Now, clear drinkable spirit can be made from virtually any organic material that's not nailed down. The natural sugars in the base, as it's called, are attractive to yeast, which then, under controlled circumstances, munch away on that sugar and produce, among other things, potable ethyl alcohol in a process dating back to time immemorial called fermentation. Now, depending on the original material, you will end up with a slightly different fermented juice. Grains give you beer, grapes give you wine, apples to cider, and so forth. Now, the next stage, distillation, boils the liquid and in the process draws off impurities, harmful alcohols like methanol, and unwanted organic compounds, leaving you with a clean spirit, hopefully. Now, 1,000 years ago, when all this was the preserve of alchemists and physicians, all European spirits pretty much looked, smelt, and tasted the same, clear and astringent. But as alchemy split and one path led to modern chemistry and the other to crystal balls and tarot cards, technology, apparatus, and technique all improved dramatically. Equally so, the main beneficiary, commercial distillation into alcoholic beverages. And the family tree really branches out around about 1500 into the proto-gins and brandies, vodkas, schnapps, and whiskies we would begin to recognize today. But another spirit was waiting in the wings, one made from fermenting and distilling directly on the byproducts of raw sugar. This was rum. Ancient writings suggest a distilled drink from sugar being made in India as far back as the 8th century, and from Cyprus in the 11th, being the first mention of what we would think of as rum in Europe. I'd bet the farm that the physicians at the medical school at Salerno in Italy and other alchemists across Europe are dabbling with sugar beet, or more correctly, the juice pressed by a byproduct of the refining process known as molasses. The end result distillate would have been a sweet, slightly earthy spirit, but moonshine, like the rest, nonetheless. However, in time, it would prove a convenient alternative or a stopgap for commercial distillers when the grain harvest failed or the grapes withered on the vine. As England took off down the road of gin making, we know from 17th century sales records and tax documents that when the grain prices rose or there was a shortage, they would make up the volume by adding both fermented molasses and cider into the pot, along with beer and botanicals. Now, in Scotland too, there was a history of sugar refining, going back to at least the 1650s and the dark days of Cromwell's Republic. Unlike colleagues in England, Scottish distillers would also turn to molasses and other sugary waste products to fill the gaps from time to time. By now, cane sugar from South America or the Caribbean was being used more than European beets. A cane is originally from Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia, and it traveled the tropical world via India, finally rooting itself in the Americas. By the 17th century, the white gold rush was sweeping Europe, and for those involved, it became a huge money spinner. Now, by the 1660s, molasses-based spirit making was commonplace across lowland Scotland, particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and not just as a filler, and the product known as Scottish rum. And according to contemporary writers, it was half decent stuff. Of course, that's all relative, but certainly good in comparison to the harsh moonshine peddled as whiskey being made on nearly every farm and estate across the southern half of the country. The slow distilled Highland whiskies, on the other hand, may have had a comparably decent taste. But this local rum was considered of high enough quality to be exported to England and beyond, and it was noted Scottish rum was scarce to be discerned from the finest foreign brandies. Now, I'd hazard a guess that back in the real world, it probably wasn't as good as French brandy, but it certainly seems to have drawn admirers, and it was a popular drink domestically as well as overseas. In his Reminiscences of Glasgow, written much later, Peter Mackenzie notes, "It is perhaps scarcely necessary to remark that the whisky trade was a roaring trade in Glasgow, but prior to that, the rum trade, in connection with the West Indies, was the most extensive and profitable one. There was a time, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, when it was rum and not whisky that was the top dog spirit on the mean streets of Glasgow." Glasgow began life as a monastic community, but its location on the River Clyde and its as a seat of an important bishopric and an ancient university meant it developed as the key city in the west of Scotland, a counterweight to the old civic centres at Perth and Stirling, and the capital itself, Edinburgh. By the mid-17th century, the city had barely grown beyond its medieval walls. But from the 1640s, merchants had begun trading with English possessions and outposts in both North America and the Caribbean, and so new industries began to develop and the old town expanded. Following the union between Scotland and England, the door of enterprise and ambition was flung open, and these fledgling opportunities across the seas exploded. It is arguable that no city would benefit or be transformed because of it more than Glasgow. Although tobacco and cotton would come to dominate the mercantile world of the city, along with all the odious apparatus that went with the triangle trade, refineries processing West Indian sugar began popping up in the 1660s, with the end product weighed and sold at the city's Trongate. But there was gold in the waste material too. By the turn of the century, there were 4 key manufacturers in Glasgow producing over 500,000 gallons of rum as a byproduct each year, and another in Edinburgh's Port of Leith producing similar numbers. These enterprises made the leading businessmen fabulously wealthy, a wealth that manifests itself in the building of a brand new town to the west, a merchant city, a gridiron of streets laid out along the north of the river and glittering with spectacular Palladian-style Georgian townhouses and mansions, and perhaps none grander than the Shawfield Mansion on the Trongate. The house was owned by Duncan Campbell of Shawfield, a colourful character in the story of whisky who pops up with monotonous regularity from the malt riots of 1725 that saw his magnificent pile burnt to the ground, to his purchase of Islay and promotion of whisky there. Well, in this story, Shawfield was one of the richest and most powerful civic leaders in the city, making his money, like so many others, on cotton, slavery, and above all, tobacco. But he also invested in a sugar house on King Street, which began life as a refinery, but by the 1720s was making most of its profit on rum distillation. The other sugar houses followed suit, and soon the place was awash in a tsunami of fiery, West Indian sugar-based Glasgow-made rum. Not to the same extent, but the rum makers in Edinburgh were also furnishing the East Coast taverns and the dram shops with the spirit of the time. However, the Haig and Steen families and their new giant custom-built whisky distilleries in Alloa and Edinburgh could smell profit. They called what they made whisky, but it was in reality moonshine, a high-proof, fierce spirit that was principally sent south to London to be rectified into gin, and as a cheap hooch to flood the rapidly growing Scottish cities. Glasgow's population had grown from 37,000 in 1755 to 145,000 in the 1770s, and it was a thirsty city. Swimming in cheap whisky, rum took a beating through the 60s and 70s, but 2 events would turn the tables once more. The American Revolutionary War closed off Glasgow, Liverpool, Bristol, and other big British cities, generating fortunes from the high-margin colonial trade, and so the merchants threw their lot in with the West Indies, directing their efforts in the Caribbean and setting up offices there to oversee the whole operation. They also turned their attention to other local sectors, and the rich merchants were soon investing in shipbuilding and the rapidly expanding linen industry, one that would boom spectacularly during the Napoleonic Wars. From Aberdeen to Dumfries, Paisley to Dundee, almost every large Scottish town had linen factories, and much of this was driven by money made on the back of sugar and rum in Glasgow and banking in Edinburgh. At the same time, in 1788, the Prime Minister, William Pitt, clamped a punitive set of taxes on the big lowland distilleries, while also offering incentives to the small-scale Highland producers, and he effectively cut off their relationship with the London gin producers. By the end of the year, nearly every large lowland distillery, from Kennet Pans, which employed a staggering 300 men, to Craigend at Stirling, closed and remained closed until the mid-1790s. Rum once more took pride of place in the taverns of Glasgow, many of which were owned by those self-same businessmen, and the small illicit shops up dark closes and alleyways selling illicit hooch. But the Highlanders and their increasingly sophisticated infrastructure, from production to smuggling, were cutting into this lucrative concern, and generally without paying any tax whatsoever. This was a portent of what was to follow in the decades ahead. But for now, rum was back on its throne as the kingpin of Glasgow. But it wasn't just Glasgow. Across Scotland, rum was becoming increasingly popular. Ayrshire, Aberdeen, Dundee, even in the whisky-loving Highlands and Islands, rum was in danger of becoming our national drink. Now, back in the city, the rum lords, men like Alexander Houston or James Ewing, or the richest of them all, John Gordon of Aikenhead, ran the show, and they met regularly at the oddly named Pig Club, housed in the Trades Hall. From here, as they ran their civic empire, they deliberated on all things rum, sugar, shipbuilding, and cross-Atlantic business. Except slavery, they never discussed slavery, possibly because Glasgow was a fervently anti-slavery city, and they thought best of it. Now, our dinners were even more ostentatious, when menus were written on gold on white satin. Glasgow was two cities, one that was filthy rich and the other which was just filthy. The slums of the Gorbals or Cowcaddens would become ingrained in the Scottish folklore and psyche as the very epitome of squalor, disease, crime, and deprivation, while the bosses dined out on the sweat of their labour. It was noted that when they met, rum was central to their gatherings, and rum punch, the universal beverage of the members of their dinners and their balls, a never failing accompaniment to their suppers and meetings. Not all was Glasgow-made rum. Some came from the Caribbean or was brought in and blended in Scotland, even aged in dank warehouses on the Clyde or Forth. But money begats money, and new ventures and enterprises brought in even more. The town grew grander, more splendid and awesome, and all centred round the magnificence of George Square, monument to the day when Glasgow was the wealthiest city on earth. But for rum, the times, they were a-changing. The Pig Club members met for the last time in 1807, by which point Glasgow's business interests had diversified beyond the old traditional core trades, and investment into the new heavy industries that would make Clydeside famous in the 19th and 20th centuries grew exponentially. The end of the war with Napoleon also changed much of the commercial landscape of Britain, and new opportunity rose in planes such as the railways. Glasgow began dealing heavily again with the emerging United States of America, but this time she did not put all her eggs in one basket. The lowland whisky makers, the Steens and the Haigs, were back, and they were back with a vengeance. These ruthless men were distillers at heart and played dirty. They lobbied for and got extra taxation for imported and domestic rum, and they undercut the prices at the point of sale. It was ruthless. The rum barons, however, were investment financiers at heart and simply couldn't compete, nor did they really want to, when it became truly cutthroat. They and their money simply moved on to the next big thing. And perhaps the final nail came with the 1823 Excise Act, which opened the door to every Tom, Dick and Harry with a £10 licence to make whisky. The Highlanders and the blenders, quick on their heels, stole a march on everyone, marrying the big, bland, lowland spirit with the robust and flavourful Highland malts. Whisky, dormant in the days of rum, had come back from the dead, and at the final post blew rum out of the water, and never looked back. Well, I very much hope you enjoyed that story of Scotland's other dram. Brought to you by David McNichol, the author of The Language of Whisky. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the history of Scotch and some of the names and places associated with the industry, then feel free to go to Amazon and look up The Language of Whisky. Thank you very much for listening.